Following his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Trump has said that he thinks Zelensky should try to negotiate a deal on his own, and that Russia is just too big to fight. Just why is the president rolling over for Vladimir Putin? But did Putin know to make sure to flatter Trump with some good old-fashioned election denial? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's crack into it. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, guys. That really makes a difference for me, especially in this new format. Okay, so Trump has had a sit-down with effectively his mouthpiece media outlet, Fox News, saying a bunch of details, actually, about what went on in that 3-hour closed-door meeting with Vladimir Putin. The first and foremost, Trump is insisting that Ukrainian President Zelensky has, quote, got to make a deal with the Russian president following his meeting. And, well, no shit. But Sean Hannity said, asked, what advice would you give to Zelensky? And Trump said, make the deal, got to make a deal. He said, Trump continued, Russia's a very big power and they're not. He means Ukraine is not. Trump said, adding the U.S. supplied Ukraine with weapons. Now, what's worth noting is that Russia, big power, and Ukraine not big is kind of reductive, given that we're 3 years into the war. And, well, frankly, if that were true, if that was all that was necessary, one, the U.S. would have won the Vietnam War. We would have also won in Afghanistan. And the Ukrainians sure have, for a country that desperately needs to make a deal as fast as possible, it's been 3 years of Russian invasion, and they really haven't gone anywhere. In fact, it has been a year since the Russians have been trying to take the town of Pokrovsk, right? We're talking about, in some places of the front line, even Russia's eastern offensive has progressed at a rate literally as slow as 6 kilometers a year, right? The Battle of Touretsk has been going on since I was in Ukraine in November. So it's really tough for me to sit there and say, oh, Ukraine's got to make a deal right away, and that Russia's so big and powerful, right? And Trump said that there was great progress, but he was unable to articulate what that progress is or looks like, adding that there's no deal until there's a deal. Trump seems to just be sort of repeating the word deal over and over again, but you can't just say a deal to manifest it. Most of these times, agreements, treaties, these have terms, right? And Trump said, they both want me there. I'll be there. You got to see it out. What I thought was most interesting, though, is some of these is one, the Russian government's official stances, right? Russia, as soon as this meeting ended, reiterated that they have made zero change in their foreign policy stances, their objectives, right? So Russian Foreign Minister's Deputy Director of Information and Press Department stated going into the meeting that Russia's position on resolving its war against Ukraine was unchanged, and that Putin outlined, of course, that he demanded in order as a prerequisite, by the way, guys, this is also really important because I've seen even major media outlets not understand this. Putin's peace conditions are not the withdrawal of Ukraine from all contested territories. These are what he describes as a prerequisite for peace negotiations. This is not even a ceasefire. This is what you have to do for Putin to sit down and have peace negotiations, is for Ukraine to abandon its established defensive positions, and then Russia will think about peace, right? Now, this would be, we would correctly identify this as sort of absurd if Ukraine were to go, hey, listen, we won't even negotiate with Russia until you, Russia, withdraw 2 to 3, 25, 30 kilometers from your current front lines, right? You'd go, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense for Ukraine, and it also doesn't make any sense for Russia because they don't really expect anyone to do it. As we've talked about, the other Russian objectives are effectively vassalizing Ukraine, right? The state of Ukraine. So they want to maintain what they call denazification, but bear in mind that Russia has declared every elected official in Ukraine to be Nazi affiliated. So that means that they want to have a veto power over any elected official in the Ukrainian government. They also demilitarization. So they want to make sure that Ukraine never has a military capable of resisting Russian aggression, meaning that Russia can continually use military blackmail to dominate Ukraine or literally just invade it again, as it's done twice already. And of course, the removal of Ukraine's current government. And, oh, by the way, they want not just Ukraine abandoning NATO, but Ukraine maintaining what they call neutrality. And this neutrality, by the way, is something that only Russia determines unilaterally. So any agreement they deem a little bit too Western or too unfavorable to Russia, they will simply declare as a violation of neutrality and forcibly roll it back. So these are the objectives that Russia has basically said. Nothing has changed. Nothing is any different. Absolutely, there has been no alteration in Russia's objectives, which of course is sort of embarrassing for President Trump, because he keeps saying that there's negotiations happening, but Russia's stance isn't changing. So again, it's almost like Vladimir Putin views talking as a performative act to waste the president's time, and more importantly, to convince President Trump to avoid implementing real meaningful sanctions that might actually change the strategic calculus of Russia. And so this is from, again, the president's mouthpiece, Fox News. 10 takeaways from Sean Hannity's interview with Putin immediately after the meeting. And bear in mind, one of the things that we've talked about, and I feel like this is pretty much true, is that the meeting was 3 hours long. President Trump, clearly in his advanced age, doesn't really have the stamina for 3-hour negotiations. That's pretty intensive. That's a lot even for a U.S. president. Generally, presidents will have their senior diplomats who are kind of deputized to work out the details, and they will arrive and sort of finalize the last couple of points, sometimes even just symbolically show up to throw their weight behind a deal. So the President Trump actually sitting down and going into hardcore negotiations for 3 hours and then coming out and sitting for an interview, that's a lot. And he looked pretty exhausted. And I think that's fair. I think, again, independent of his own, what I think is poor policymaking, that's part of Putin's strategy, I think, was actually to grind President Trump down and to exhaust him. Right? One, he said there's no deal until there's a deal. Putin wants to see it done, right? The president noted that Hannity said he believes Putin is only open to peace, but that he wants to see it done. Well, this is, again, one of those things that's technically true, but kind of stupid, because, yeah, Putin obviously didn't want to be involved in this war. He wanted this war to end in 3 days. But he doesn't want it so badly that he's willing to accept the Ukrainian offer of an immediate unconditional ceasefire and beginning peace negotiations. So instead, clearly, he prefers war and feels that continued fighting is going to benefit him more than it's going to hurt his position. Right? Now, Trump said there was a single big issue that they don't agree on, but he was not prepared to say what it was, which is pretty fascinating. But we can guess what it is because there's several sticking points, in fact, including withdrawal of Ukrainian territory. And in all likelihood, there's even more things Putin is probably asking for, because as we have talked about, Vladimir Putin is a very skilled and very savvy political actor. And so you don't become the 2-decade dictator of Russia by only playing defense, right? You know when there's an opportunity to take a big bite out of your adversary, and Putin views the United States, the West, as his adversaries. When there's when your adversary gives you a chance to take a big bite, you don't just take a small bite because that's what you were hoping to get, right? So, one, of course, classic Fox News editing. Literally, you don't even need an intern to do this. You need just ChatGPT. Just be like, feed it into ChatGPT and be like, hey, clean this up. Remove the spelling errors, please. But we can't even get that. So, again, he says it's up to the Ukrainian president to get it done, and maybe the European nations, which I think is actually true. I think I thought that was Trump's new policy, to say, listen, we will be like China in this, where we will sell weapons to the Europeans, who will then give it to the Ukrainians because it's an important European security issue. And then say, listen, it's for the Europeans. We're not going to be involved. The Europeans can sit down with Zelensky and they can figure out how they want this thing to end, but it's not my job, which is not a stance, right? Like that's at least a policy. Again, do I think it's the best policy? Nah, not really. I think we have an obligation to our allies. The Europeans definitely view Russia as a deep existential threat. But what I thought was most interesting, right? One, he says, oh, Russia respects America now, which when asked what he thought, brought Putin to the negotiating table, which, by the way, physically sitting at the negotiating table is not sitting at the negotiating table. You actually have to sit there and be willing to negotiate, which has not happened. As discussed, Putin, no stance has changed. Trump says, I don't want to say anything brought him, but he's a very smart guy. Nothing brought him to the table, so to speak. He said, I think he respects our country now. He didn't respect it under Biden. I can tell you that he had no respect for it. Which just doesn't make any sense, because if he respected it, he would have changed his policy to reflect U.S. desires, and that hasn't happened. In fact, U.S. policy has changed to reflect Russian desires. So, who respects whom? But I think the biggest point showed up here at the bottom, right? Which is that Trump shared that Putin told him he believed the 2020 election was rigged because of widespread mail-in voting. Trump's exact quote, "You can't have a great democracy with mail-in voting." And when we look over here, you can see this is the full quote. The full quote is actually even more insane. Quote, Vladimir Putin said, this is from Trump, "Your election was rigged because you had mail-in voting," which is, again, rich coming from Putin. He said, "No country has mail-in voting." Just not true. It's impossible to have mail-in voting and have honest elections. Right? And then Trump added that Putin said, if you had won the election, you wouldn't have had a war. You'd have all these people, millions of people alive now instead of dead, Trump said in an interview. Now, worth noting is that Russia and Vladimir Putin's Russia is a dictatorship. The elections are performances, much like the fact that Kim Jong-un technically wins an election like every 2 years in North Korea by 99.9% of the vote. Probably because there's always one person who symbolically votes for his dad. And what's worth noting is that basically, remember, Russia, if you combine Putin's United Russia Party and the Russian Communist Party that he also controls, parties directly controlled by Putin control around 99% of the Russian State Duma. These are not free and fair elections. There has never been an opposition party, an actual opposition to Putin, who has won an election at any level, not in 2 decades. It is unfair to call this a democracy, right? So Putin lecturing Trump on what constitutes real democracy is pretty rich. And also Putin sitting there and being like, well, I think you won the election. And again, given the scale and scope of Russian assistance in the US election is also pretty rich. But you also really probably shouldn't, you can't really trust what Russia says, even about things like the war, right? Because I want to point out 2 historic videos here I pulled up just for your edification. Actually, but before we take a look at these, I want to mention 2 things. The first is, of course, that if you want to force me to go on a sprawling death march, you can donate to our fundraiser. We're raising funds to defend against fiber optic FPVs. This is for a wide variety of Ukrainian units, but notably the 59th. So if you want to help them out, you can donate, and actually your donation will be matched by an anonymous Dutch donor. But if you're in the US, it's a 501c3, a registered charity. It is tax deductible. And if we hit our goal, I will literally sign up for and attempt to run an ultra marathon in the next 3 weeks. And I'll put it all on YouTube. I'll document the whole thing. So if you're interested in seeing me suffer for your amusement, you can do that. So the link is in the description, of course. And if you want to support the channel, combatvetnews.com, that's the place. Just remember, drop it in there. Go over, become a member, support this, right? You guys know I've made I've become much more explicit in calling out what I think is the bullshit coming out of everybody across the political spectrum. But notably the people in the White House. And boy, that has not endeared me to some people. So if you appreciate it, sign up, become a member. You get access to twice a week, uncensored, exclusive combat videos, stuff that YouTube, that it's not even like episodes that go on YouTube, but are early or whatever. No, it's brand new stuff. And there's an archive of hundreds of it, plus a Q&A. You can't beat it. Again, links right there in the description. Okay. So Vladimir Putin sitting there and saying, listen, guys, listen, Trump, if you had won 2020, there would never have been a war, which is like, doesn't make any sense. Like even if that were true, why on earth would Putin say it? Because if that's so true, if Trump's so intimidating, well, he's in office now and there is a war, but you can't trust what Putin says. And here's 2 examples of it. This is from March of 2022, just literally 12 days or 24 days after, no, 12 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov maintained that Russia had not invaded Ukraine in the first place. Right? Ukraine has not been invaded. And that the attack yesterday on a maternity hospital in southern Ukraine was fake news, according to Sergei Lavrov. Here's another video where Sergei Lavrov repeats the same lie, right? He says that Russia, he tells the BBC, Russia did not invade Ukraine and there is no war going on there. Okay? So when Putin says things like, Putin says these absolutely fantastically false claims, and repeatedly Trump treats them as completely sincere, right? And so the takeaway here is that, like, Russia views these things as performances because Russia's, and Putin's Russia is a criminal state, and they have a Soviet mentality towards these things, which is that overt diplomacy, the things that happen in public, these are performances put on for the benefit of different audiences, right? In this case, put on for the benefit of a Russian domestic audience, a U.S. domestic audience, right? And of course, for the international community as an audience for Putin to sort of flex his power and sort of have a Russia, we're back moment. But the fact is that the things he actually says are just have no reason to have basis in truth, right? And they exist in a lot of cases. He lies expressly to sow doubt, right? This because the international community, their goal was to create this idea by saying these things to create chaos, to sit there and go, well, we don't know what's true. And once you don't know what's true, it's like being blindfolded, right? If you're blindfolded and dropped into a room, and you're not sure where you are or how big the room is or what's in front of you, what do? You freeze. Well, that's true of international actions. That's true of countries and governments. The more you can blind a person, a country, a government, the more that you are going to be able to exploit them, the more likely you're going to get them to freeze. And if they need to take action to protect themselves, in the case of, again, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the more they can create this level of chaos, the more they can push a fake narrative, not just to Ukraine, but their goal is also to do it to Ukrainian allies, potential allies who might intervene on their behalf. And so by saying we never invaded Ukraine and there is no war there, just like by saying that I would never have invaded if you had been president or your elections were absolutely fraudulent and fake, what Putin's doing is trying to freeze the U.S. public and in part Trump himself into this state where they are unable to take action because they're unable to be sure. What if Putin's telling the truth and it's the U.S. government who's lying? What if what if Putin's a liar but he's correct? Like what happens? Can we know anything? And that is ultimately, I think, the final form of the Russian disinformation operation is to simply not create a world in which you believe untrue things, but in which you feel you are blinded, and governments feel they are blinded by what is really happening in the world. And once they've been blinded, they won't ever take action, decisive action, because they can't actually appraise the situation. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Cheers.